Good morning, students. We've been seeing in this chapter that of power sharing that how two different countries located in two different parts of the world, entirely different cultures to follow, how they have had a same problem whereby the more diversity you have, it sounds very interesting that yes, that society has a great amount of diversity, but then it is very difficult for those diverse communities to work together, come together, live together, and respect each other's diversity. You can still be living together, but then unless you do not respect the diversity of the other group, the ethnic group, it becomes very difficult to live in a peaceful society. Otherwise, there would always be conflicts, there would always be skirmishes. That is just obvious. Now, this is the same thing. Now, continuing, and yesterday we also saw that the problems, particularly which which was aggravated in Sri Lanka. Because, as I said, Sri Lanka got independence not because it had a very very eventful or very great kind of a freedom struggle, or very bloody, where a lot of bloodshed happened, or greatly peaceful, or they had some great mass movements and civil disobedience, kind of like we had in India. So they didn't have those kind of movements, okay. And Sri Lankans were always inspired by what we were doing in India, our freedom fighters were doing in India, because both the cases we were fighting Britishers. We were fighting Britishers, they were fighting Britishers, and both were doing it at the same point in time. So naturally, there was a lot to learn from each other. But here it was, as I said, though it's not very covered in the history books of India, that Gandhiji visited Sri Lanka on the invitation of the Sri Lankan freedom fighters in the year 1927. And and it was just not a token visit, or a very perfunctory one, that just for the sake of tick mark activity. But he indeed stayed there for about good 20 to 23 days, traveled almost the whole part of Sri Lanka, gave numerous speeches to all diverse sections of the Sri Lankan population, right from the Buddhists to the Tamils, to the Sinhalese, to the Muslims, Christians, all of them, and emphasized the role of non-violent struggle against the Britishers. Now, the reason why, and majoritarianism took in Sri Lanka was that in 1948, that is February 1948, that is when the Sri Lankans celebrate their Independence Day. Um, the British left Sri Lanka just because they were leaving the subcontinent, right? They were not chased away in Sri Lanka. Okay, had they wished, they could have stayed in Sri Lanka probably for another 100 years. Who knows, right? So the point was that once they were gone, Sri Lankans did not share that kind of the story of struggle, every segment fighting together in a huge amount of solidarity against the British. So all the communities would have suffered the same kind of hardship. That kind of story was lacking in Sri Lanka the way it was in India. So when we got independence, it was just that there was so much of pain that we had shared with each other, that when the framers of the Indian Constitution came together to devise and to write a constitution, it was not in the faintest of their minds that yes, this constitution would be about a Hindu majority constitution, or it would be showering any kind of preferential treatment to any segment of Indian population. The constitution was right in the beginning, it was very clear that yes, it would be a constitution for all the Indians. It would be same for all. The law books would be written in a fashion where everyone is treated equal in the eyes of law. There would be no trace of, at least that's what the intention was, there would be no trace of discrimination or favorable treatment. Now, this thing was not there in Sri Lanka. So, the moment the British left, there was a scramble, there was a stampede by different sections of the Sri Lankan population to ensure that they have or their people or their group has an edge in the frame of independent Sri Lanka. And the first thing which they wanted to naturally was to consolidate their position in to do was to consolidate their position, and the best way to do was to actually influence the constitution. So that was what happened. That is what a majority the Sinhala population did, because students, you have to understand, in a democracy, when you have a democracy is a double-edged sword. Democracy, if the rulers and if the leaders, if the leadership is not a very benevolent leadership, it's not a very evolved leadership, it would prefer, because then it is about numbers, so it tends to go towards majoritarianism. They feel that yes, it is about voting. I would always have the votes. All I need is my, just 51% of the votes, so I would be winning. So I can really bother. I do not really need to bother about the remaining 49%. And that is what happened in Sri Lanka, whereby the Sinhali majority actually tailor made the constitution to suit its own requirements, right? And gradually, chip by chip, they started giving more and more power and more authority to the Sinhali population, ignoring the rights and ignoring the needs of the other segments of Sri Lankan population, that is the Tamils and the Muslims and the Christians. They were to be ignored, but now it was all about Sinhalas and Sinhalas. Okay, if the Sinhalas were Muslims, then it was fine, but then if they were Tamils, then God help them. So in 1956, that's where it continues. An act was passed to recognize Sinhala as the only official language. Thus, disregarding Tamil, the governments followed preferential policies that favored Sinhala applicants for even university positions and government jobs. A new constitution stipulated that the state shall protect and foster Buddhism. The guys in India, you have nothing, nowhere in the law books where it says that a certain section of the population, whichever that section is, a certain section of the population would be preferred for government jobs, or a certain section of population would be preferred for the university positions. It would never, it's unthinkable in India. The courts would probably put you behind bars, right, for spreading communal hatred. Now, but then in Sri Lanka, that is what they were doing. In India, it is impossible that a state would try on its behalf to promote and foster a particular religion, right? So in India, but it is unthinkable. But in Sri Lanka, we see here that a new constitution stipulated that the state shall protect and foster. Protection, of course, uh, every country, every constitution tries to protect all the segments of its population. Okay, but then particularly picking it that yes, Buddhism needs to be protected, and it is Buddhism that needs to be promoted and encouraged. This is clear discrimination, right, against the other communities and the other faiths. So all these government measures coming one after the other gradually increased the feeling of alienation among the Sri Lankan Tamils. And then they felt that none of the major political parties led by the Buddhist Sinhala leaders was sensitive to their language and culture. They felt that the constitution and the government policies denied them equal political rights, discriminated against them in getting jobs and other opportunities, and ignored their interests. Students, one thing you need to understand, that culture is not just about song and dance. That's what we kind of normally assume, that the culture is primarily about songs, dances, lehenga or salwar kurta and these kind of issues. No, they are important. They do give and identity. But the culture is not just about song and dance. It's a culmination, it's a combination of all different things. It's about language, it's about festivals, it is about the food that you eat. Everything together, every component comes together and gives you an identity, which can be a cultural identity. And cultural identity are very strong identities, students. Mm, though I don't think it is there in your syllabus, you have to understand one of the very important reasons why Bangladesh was born in 1971, though earlier it was in 1947, it was divided as Eastern Pakistan, and it was born as Eastern Pakistan, but it became Bangladesh in 1971, precisely because one of the very, very important reasons for that was after independence in 1947, when Eastern Pakistan was formed, that is, the majority of the people in Eastern Pakistan used to speak Bengali. Their culture was Bengali, right? Bengalis have always been moderates and liberals compared to what Western Pakistan was about. Now, the government of Pakistan imposed Urdu language in Bangladesh, that is today's Bangladesh, which then was Eastern Pakistan. Now, the Bengalis who had been speaking Bengali and following Bengali culture for centuries, they definitely felt extremely, extremely agitated, because now how can Urdu be imposed as a language on the Bengali speaking people? Now, that had always been a huge source of resentment. The cultural invasion of the Urdu speaking people of Western Pakistan into the cultural affairs of people, Muslims. And mind you, both these lands are majority Muslim population, but even then, Muslims in Eastern Pakistan completely objected to their tampering of their culture by the Urdu speaking Western Pakistan. And for 30 years, it was always the Eastern Pakistan was always in turmoil. And the opportunity came in 1971, where when it became a pressure cooker situation, and Eastern Pakistan became independent and declared itself to be a new country altogether, completely independent of Western Pakistan, and it became Bangladesh. So you see, culture is not just about song and dance and food and gods. No, cultural identities are extremely important identities for any segment of population anywhere on the planet, because it gives you an identity, it gives you a mark, it makes you what you are, right? And these things were important even for the Sri Lankan Tamils, who felt that chip by chip, block by block, their identity was being eroded by the Sinhala majority population, and they picked up, and they felt that the leadership of the political leadership of Sinhalas was definitely not at all sensitive to their concerns, and they picked up arms in around 80s under Prabhakaran, though I don't think this name is mentioned here. But then the Sri Lankan Tamils waged a fierce and a very violent struggle against the Sri Lankan state, and that is what it is about. That was the problem about majoritarianism in Sri Lanka. So that is, I think that should be it. Tomorrow we shall start accommodation in Belgium, and we shall see that if the outcome was any different in Belgium, or if it went the Sri Lankan way. Okay, because they also had complexities of diverse ethnic groups and languages. Thank you.